Part 1. The Grin That Would Haunt Hollywood. The spring air hung thick with salt and possibility over Neptune City, New Jersey, in 1937. It was April 22nd when Ethel May Nicholson, though that wasn't quite her real name, as nothing in this story would be quite what it seemed, gave birth to a boy in the cramped quarters above her father's beauty parlor. The infant's cry pierced through the sound of scissors snipping hair downstairs, a wail that seemed to carry something wild and unknowable in it. They named him John Joseph Nicholson III, but the world would come to know him simply as Jack. The room smelled of permanent wave solution and talcum powder. Ethel May, just 17 years old, held the baby with trembling hands while her mother June hovered nearby, her face a mask of forced cheerfulness that barely concealed the scandal brewing beneath their respectable working-class existence. Outside the window, the Depression still had America by the throat, though Roosevelt's New Deal was beginning to ease the grip. But inside that small room, a different kind of drama was unfolding, one that would remain hidden for 37 years. June Nicholson, a formidable woman who ran the beauty parlor with an iron hand, had made a decision. In an era when unwed motherhood could destroy a young woman's future, when whispers could ruin a family standing in their tight-knit Irish Catholic community, she had constructed an elaborate fiction. Baby Jack would be raised as her son, not her grandson. Ethel May would become his sister. The father, a married showman named Donald Fursillo who performed under the stage name Don Rose, would disappear from the narrative entirely, leaving only his DNA as evidence of his existence. Jack grew up in a household of women and secrets. His father, John Nicholson, was mostly absent, a sign painter and alcoholic who drifted in and out of their lives like smoke. The beauty parlor became young Jack's playground and theater, where he watched women transform themselves, where gossip flowed as freely as the hair tonic, where he learned that people wore masks and that identity itself was malleable. He absorbed it all with those eyes, pale, penetrating, unnervingly intelligent eyes that seemed to see through surfaces to the truth beneath. The boy was trouble from the start, but charming trouble. He had a grin that could melt resistance, a quick wit that kept him one step ahead of punishment, and an energy that his teachers found either exhilarating or exhausting. At Manasquan High School, he discovered the stage, and something clicked. In the school's production of The Diary of Anne Frank, Jack found a place where pretending was not just acceptable but celebrated, where the ability to slip into another skin was an art form rather than a survival mechanism. But it was basketball that first captured his imagination, the speed of it, the improvisation, the way you could fake left and go right, keeping your opponent off balance. He wasn't tall enough to be great, but he had what the coaches called court sense, an ability to read the game like others read books. Years later, he would bring that same unpredictability to his performances, keeping directors, co-stars, and audiences perpetually off guard, never quite sure where he was going until he'd already arrived. By 1954, 17-year-old Jack was working as an office boy at the MGM Cartoon Studio in Los Angeles, having followed his sister, June, to California. Ethel May, the woman he believed was his sister, had gone west years earlier, trying to make it as a dancer. Jack's mother, June, had remarried, and the family configuration had shifted again, another layer of fiction built upon the original lie. Los Angeles in the mid-1950s was a city of dreams and delusions, where thousands of beautiful hopefuls arrived weekly on Greyhound buses, their heads full of stardom and their pockets empty. The Hollywood studio system was beginning to crack under pressure from television and antitrust laws, but it still held power. Jack got his job through a family connection, and for a while, he thought he might become an animator. He had talent with a pencil, and the cartoon studio felt safe, creative, respectable. But the MGM building was adjacent to the lot where they made movies, and Jack couldn't help wandering over during lunch breaks, watching the organized chaos of film production. He saw actors transforming into cowboys and kings, watched directors orchestrate controlled madness, observed the brutal efficiency of the Hollywood machine. And something in him, something hungry and reckless, whispered that animation wasn't enough. In the evenings, he took acting classes at Jeff Corey's workshop, a legendary incubator of talent where the teaching was based on Stanislavski's method, on finding emotional truth rather than just hitting marks and delivering lines. The class was full of young actors who would later define a generation: Robert Towne, Roger Corman's future stable of rebels, and others who understood that something was shifting in American culture. The bland conformity of the Eisenhower era was beginning to show cracks, and these young artists sensed that audiences were hungry for something rawer, more honest, more dangerous. Corey, who had been blacklisted during the McCarthy era for refusing to name names before the House Un-American Activities Committee, taught his students to dig deep, to find the wound in every character, to bring their own pain and confusion to their work. For Jack, who was literally living a lie, though he didn't know it yet, this approach felt natural. He had spent his entire life reading the room, adapting, performing different versions of himself depending on who was watching. His early jobs were brutal exercises in humility. He auditioned constantly, facing rejection after rejection, his unconventional looks, those eyebrows, that lopsided grin, the receding hairline that started early, working against him in an era that still favored square-jawed conventional handsomeness. But he persisted with a stubbornness that would become his trademark. When he finally landed small parts, they were forgettable: a teenager here, a young tough there, nothing that showcased the volcanic talent brewing beneath the surface. Then came Roger Corman, a man who would accidentally midwife the new Hollywood by giving young talent a chance to fail cheaply and learn quickly. Corman, the king of B-movies, was making low-budget horror and crime films at a pace that would be unthinkable today, sometimes shooting an entire feature in 3 days. He needed actors who could nail a scene in 1 or 2 takes, who could bring energy and commitment to ridiculous premises, who could make audiences believe in monsters and mayhem despite the visible zippers on the creatures' suits. Jack's first significant role was in Cry Baby Killer, 1958, a Corman production about a troubled teenager who holds hostages after a fight. It was pure exploitation material, but Jack brought something unexpected to it, a genuine sense of panic and confusion, a vulnerability that elevated the B-movie material. Corman noticed. Here was an actor who didn't condescend to the material, who could find truth in trash. Through the late 1950s and early 1960s, Jack worked steadily but remained unknown, appearing in films with titles like The Little Shop of Horrors, shot in 2 days on leftover sets, The Wild Ride, and Studs Lonigan. He was learning his craft in the best possible way, through repetition, through trial and error, through watching his performances and cringing at his mistakes. He was also learning about filmmaking from the inside, observing how directors worked, how scripts were constructed, how the business functioned. And he was building relationships with other young rebels who sensed that the old Hollywood was dying and something new needed to be born. He became close with Monte Hellman, a director who shared his interest in existential westerns and character studies disguised as genre films. He developed a partnership with screenwriter Robert Towne, who would later script Chinatown. He joined the circle of actors and filmmakers who gathered at beach houses in Malibu, smoking marijuana, discussing Antonioni and Bergman, believing that American cinema could be as artistically ambitious as European film. But by 1967, after a decade of grinding work, Jack Nicholson was 30 years old and going nowhere. He had been in over a dozen films that almost nobody had seen. He was broke, living with his girlfriend Sandra Knight. They'd married in 1962 and had a daughter. But the relationship was fraying, wondering if he should give up and try something else. Maybe writing, maybe directing, anything but continuing to bash his head against the wall of an industry that didn't seem to want what he was offering. He had no way of knowing that everything was about to change, that the counterculture was about to explode into the mainstream, that Hollywood was about to be taken over by a generation that had grown up on European art films and American B-movies, that his particular combination of intelligence, danger, and charisma was about to become exactly what America needed to see on screen. The revolution was coming, and Jack Nicholson, still believing his sister was his mother, still unaware of the fundamental fiction at the heart of his identity, was about to become its grinning, unsettling face. Part 2: Easy Rider and the Birth of a New Hollywood. The year 1968 was tearing America apart at the seams. Martin Luther King Jr. fell to an assassin's bullet in April, then Robert Kennedy in June. The Democratic National Convention in Chicago descended into violent chaos as police beat protesters in the streets, while the whole world watched on television. Vietnam was consuming young men and the nation's conscience. The counterculture wasn't just a movement anymore, it was a generational war, and the old certainties were burning. In Hollywood, the studio system was in its death throes. The big-budget musicals and biblical epics that had sustained the industry were bombing spectacularly. Dr. Dolittle, Star, Paint Your Wagon. Massive productions that felt hopelessly out of touch with an audience that was increasingly young, college-educated, and hungry for something that reflected their reality. The executives, still wearing their suits and making decisions from the same playbook they'd used for 40 years, were hemorrhaging money and scrambling for answers. Jack Nicholson, now 31, was still grinding. He'd appeared in Hell's Angels on Wheels, a biker exploitation film that had given him a taste of the outlaw culture that was bubbling up from the margins. He'd worked with Monte Hellman on 2 existential westerns, The Shooting and Ride in the Whirlwind, that virtually nobody saw but that represented the kind of ambitious, artistically serious filmmaking he believed in. He'd even tried his hand at writing, penning a psychedelic head trip called The Trip, for Roger Corman, starring Peter Fonda and Dennis Hopper. It was that script that connected him to what would become Easy Rider. Fonda and Hopper had been marinating in an idea. A motorcycle movie that would capture the zeitgeist, that would show what was really happening in America, that would bring the counterculture to the screen without compromise or condescension. They'd secured financing from Columbia Pictures, a measly $400,000 budget that the studio considered a throwaway, an experiment they could afford to lose. The original plan didn't include Jack. Hopper was directing and starring as Billy, the wild-eyed, paranoid rider. Fonda was playing Captain America, the cooler, more centered of the 2 bikers making a run from Los Angeles to New Orleans after a drug deal. The role of George Hanson, the alcoholic ACLU lawyer they'd pick up in a small southern town, was supposed to go to Rip Torn. But Torn and Hopper got into a violent confrontation during pre-production. Accounts vary on who pulled a knife on whom, and suddenly the part was available. Jack was in the editing room working on Head, a surreal monkeys movie he'd co-written with Bob Rafelson, when Fonda called. They needed someone immediately. They were already on location, already shooting, already behind schedule because Hopper's directorial inexperience and cocaine-fueled perfectionism were turning the production into chaos. Could Jack fly to New Orleans right away? There was no real script for his scenes, just an outline. They'd improvise. The pay was minimal. Was he interested? He caught the next flight. When Jack arrived on the New Orleans set in late summer 1968, he found a production that was less a professional film shoot than a rolling party barely contained within the structure of making a movie. Hopper was shooting thousands of feet of film, burning through the budget, convinced he was creating a masterpiece. The crew was small, mostly young people who believed in the project. Many of them were high much of the time. The whole thing felt less like traditional filmmaking and more like documenting a moment that was happening whether cameras were present or not. Jack had never smoked marijuana on camera before. The scene around the campfire, where George Hanson tries pot for the first time and delivers his famous monologue about UFOs and Venusians, was shot with actual joints. Jack got genuinely stoned, and you can see it in his performance. The way his eyes go glassy, the way his speech patterns shift, the way he becomes simultaneously more paranoid and more philosophically expansive. It wasn't method acting in the Strasberg sense. It was something more direct, more honest, more dangerous. But it was another scene that showcased what Jack could really do. George Hanson's death scene, beaten to death by local rednecks while sleeping in his sleeping bag, required no drugs, no tricks. Jack drew on something deeper, something that connected to his own sense of vulnerability, his understanding that America could turn viciously on anyone who didn't conform. The South they were filming in still bore the scars of the civil rights struggle, and the threat of violence against outsiders, against hippies and longhairs, was utterly real. Several times during the shoot, locals had threatened the cast and crew. They weren't just making a movie about intolerance, they were experiencing it. The character of George Hanson became Jack's first great creation on film. Here was a man caught between two Americas, the button-down, bourbon-soaked world of small-town Southern respectability, and the freewheeling counterculture represented by Billy and Captain America. George knows the system is rotten, corrupt, hypocritical, but he's too damaged and too scared to fully break free. Until, briefly, he does, joining the bikers on their journey and experiencing a taste of freedom before that freedom gets him killed. Jack brought layers to the role that weren't in the minimal script. The football helmet George insists on wearing becomes both a comic detail and a symbol of his fundamental fearfulness, his need for protection in a world he perceives as dangerous. His drunken philosophizing about freedom. They're gonna talk to you and talk to you and talk to you about individual freedom. But they see a free individual, it's gonna scare 'em. Wasn't just dialogue. It was prophecy, a warning about what the film itself would provoke. When Easy Rider was released in July 1969, just days after the first moon landing and weeks before Woodstock, it detonated like a cultural bomb. Made for $400,000, it would gross over $60 million worldwide, becoming one of the most profitable films ever made to that point. But more important than the money was what it represented. Here was a film made outside the studio system's creative control, a film that spoke in the language of the counterculture, that took drugs and rock music and sexual freedom seriously rather than as cautionary tale subjects, that ended not with redemption but with senseless violence and the death of its heroes. The studios, desperate for relevance and terrified of missing the youth market, suddenly realized that a new model was possible. You could make films cheaply with young directors, aimed at the college audience, with none of the traditional Hollywood gloss, and people would come. The floodgates opened. Francis Ford Coppola, Martin Scorsese, Peter Bogdanovich, William Friedkin, Bob Rafelson, a generation of film school-educated directors influenced more by the French New Wave than by John Ford suddenly found themselves with studio deals and creative freedom. This was the new Hollywood, and Jack Nicholson had just become one of its first stars. But stardom was strange for Jack. At 32, he wasn't a conventional leading man. He was balding, with a prominent forehead and those unnerving eyebrows that could telegraph malice or mischief with the slightest movement. His smile wasn't reassuring, it was wolfish, suggesting he knew something you didn't, probably something unsettling. His voice had a nasal quality that could turn sneering or seductive depending on his intention. He looked like the friend who might steal your girlfriend, the lawyer who'd find the loophole in your contract, the charming sociopath who'd talk his way out of anything. Hollywood didn't quite know what to do with him at first. His Best Supporting Actor nomination for Easy Rider, he lost to Gig Young-in. They shoot horses, don't they? Proved he was being taken seriously, but the roles that immediately followed were scattered, uncertain. He did On a Clear Day You Can See Forever, with Barbra Streisand, a big-budget musical that felt like a step backward into the old Hollywood he was trying to escape. He worked with his friend Bob Rafelson again on 5 Easy Pieces, a low-budget character study that would become more important than anyone realized. 5 Easy Pieces, released in 1970, was the film that proved Easy Rider wasn't a fluke, that Jack Nicholson wasn't just a hippie actor who got lucky. The character of Bobby DeP was complex in ways that American film characters rarely were, a classical pianist from a wealthy, cultured family who's rejected that world to work on oil rigs and sleep with waitresses, but who can't escape his own intelligence and alienation, who's too smart for the working-class life he's chosen but too damaged for the upper-class life he fled. The famous chicken salad scene, where Bobby erupts at a waitress who won't deviate from menu protocol, became iconic not because it was about chicken salad but because it captured a particularly American rage at petty bureaucracy, at the small humiliations of service culture, at the way rules and systems grind down human spontaneity. Jack played it perfectly, starting with patient negotiation, escalating to sarcasm, finally exploding into, "I'll make it as easy for you as I can," before sweeping the water glasses off the table. It was method acting as rock and roll. But it was the scene with his stroke-paralyzed father, where Bobby delivers a monologue about his failures and disappointments to a man who cannot respond, that showed the depth Jack could access. He wasn't just playing anger or alienation anymore. He was playing the specific pain of wanting connection and being unable to achieve it, of recognizing your own inadequacy and being helpless to change it. Critics noticed. He received his first Best Actor nomination, losing to George C. Scott in Patton. The roles began coming faster now, more substantial, more interesting. Mike Nichols cast him in Carnal Knowledge, 1971, playing Jonathan, a man whose attitudes toward women curdle from undergraduate callousness into middle-aged misogyny. It was a brave choice, playing someone genuinely unlikable, someone whose sexual politics were toxic even by early 1970s standards. Jack didn't try to make Jonathan sympathetic. He played the character's emptiness, his inability to connect with women as human beings rather than as objects to be conquered or possessed. Then came The Last Detail, 1973, directed by Hal Ashby from a script by Robert Towne, Jack's old friend from the struggling actor days. Jack played Budusky, a Navy lifer tasked with transporting a young sailor to prison. It should have been a simple assignment, a standard military procedural, but Budusky decides to show the kid, who's being sent away for 8 years for stealing $40, one last good time before imprisonment. The role gave Jack something he hadn't really had before, the opportunity to play decency, loyalty, even tenderness, all wrapped in profanity and military machismo. Budusky's rage at the injustice of the system, his determination to give Klinger some good memories before prison, his final impotent fury when he has to hand the kid over anyway, all of it felt lived in, real, heartbreaking. Jack's performance was a masterclass in how to make virtue appear masculine, how to show that caring could coexist with toughness. The profanity in The Last Detail was unprecedented. The script contained over 300 fucks, and the studio wanted them cut. Jack and Ashby fought to keep them, arguing that this was how military men actually spoke, that sanitizing the language would be a betrayal of the character's reality. They won, and the film became another landmark in the dissolution of the old production code standards. But nothing prepared Hollywood, or Jack, for what came next. Roman Polanski, the Polish director who'd made Rosemary's Baby, and survived the Manson family's murder of his pregnant wife Sharon Tate, had a script by Robert Towne called Chinatown. It was a neo-noir set in 1937 Los Angeles, involving water rights, corruption, and secrets that went deeper than anyone expected. Polanski wanted Jack for the lead role of J.J. Sheet, a private detective who thinks he's seen everything until he discovers how naive he's really been. The production was difficult from the start. Polanski and Towne clashed over the ending. Towne wanted something hopeful, Polanski insisted on darkness, and Polanski won. Jack, caught between his friend and his director, tried to mediate but mostly focused on his performance, on creating a detective who was smart and tough but ultimately powerless against the forces arrayed against him. There was an incident during shooting that became Hollywood legend. Polanski, a perfectionist obsessive about details, insisted that a hair protruding from Jack's nose was visible and distracting. Jack disagreed. Polanski insisted. Finally, in the middle of a take, Polanski ran onto the set and plucked the hair from Jack's nostril himself. Jack's eyes watered from the pain, but he stayed in character, and Polanski kept the cameras rolling. It was the kind of maniacal dedication, or madness, that defined the new Hollywood's best work. When Chinatown was released in June 1974, critics recognized immediately that they were watching something special. Here was a film that honored the classic noir tradition while subverting it, that looked gorgeous while telling a story of corruption and depravity, that featured a hero who fails utterly to save anyone or anything that matters. And at its center was Jack Nicholson, giving a performance of such controlled intensity that every reaction, every slow burn of realization that things were worse than he thought, registered with perfect clarity. The final line, "Forget it, Jake. It's Chinatown," became one of cinema's most quoted, a shorthand for systematic corruption so deep that individual action becomes meaningless. Jake Sheet learns that the evil he's uncovered isn't an aberration but the foundation on which Los Angeles was built, that the woman he's tried to protect is doomed precisely because she sought protection, that his very existence as a private eye trying to find truth and justice is a cruel joke in a world where power writes its own rules. Jack received his third Best Actor nomination in 4 years. He lost again, this time to Art Carney in Harry and Tonti. But by now it didn't matter. At 37 years old, after nearly 2 decades of struggling, Jack Nicholson had become the face of a new kind of American masculinity on screen, intelligent, dangerous, unpredictable, capable of both tenderness and cruelty, impossible to pin down or fully understand. He was the star of his generation, and he was just getting started. Part 3: Flying over the Cuckoo's Nest and Discovering the Truth. The morning after the 1975 Academy Awards ceremony, Jack Nicholson woke up in his house on Mulholland Drive with an Oscar statuette on his nightstand and a hangover that felt like divine punishment. He had finally won Best Actor for One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, after 3 previous nominations, and the celebration had stretched until dawn. But as he lay there, watching the Los Angeles light filter through the curtains, what struck him wasn't triumph, but a strange sense of dislocation, as if winning the thing he chased for so long had revealed how arbitrary all of it was. The journey to that Oscar had begun 2 years earlier, when Kirk Douglas's son Michael approached him about a property Kirk had owned since the 1960s. Ken Kesey's novel, One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, had been adapted into a successful Broadway play starring Kirk, but no studio would finance a film version. The story, about a rebellious spirit crushed by institutional authority, set entirely in a mental institution, seemed uncommercial, depressing, a guaranteed money loser. Michael Douglas, then known primarily as a television actor from the streets of San Francisco, was trying to produce his first feature film, and he was having trouble getting anyone to take him seriously. Jack read the script and immediately understood what it could be. McMurphy, the con man who fakes insanity to escape prison work detail and ends up in a psychiatric ward, was a role that combined everything he'd been building toward: the rebellious energy of Easy Rider, the rage against systems from 5 Easy Pieces, the working-class authenticity of The Last Detail, and something new, a kind of doomed heroism, a man who sacrifices himself to wake others from their stupor. But there was a problem. The director, Milos Forman, a Czech filmmaker who'd fled the Soviet invasion of his country in 1968, wasn't sure about Jack. Forman had seen his films, recognized his talent, but worried that Jack was too much of a star now, that audiences would see Jack Nicholson rather than McMurphy. He wanted to do something radical, cast the film entirely with real mental patients, make it a documentary fiction hybrid. The producers talked him back from that ledge, but Forman remained skeptical about using Hollywood actors for most roles. They shot at Oregon State Hospital in Salem, an actual functioning mental institution where One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest author Ken Kesey had once worked as a night attendant. The hospital agreed to let them film in exchange for a renovation of the ward they'd use. What this meant practically was that Jack and the other actors, playing patients, were working in real institutional spaces, sleeping in actual ward beds, eating institutional food, and constantly encountering real patients who wandered through the production. Forman's approach was to blur the line between the actors and the patients as much as possible. He cast Dr. Dean Brooks, the actual superintendent of the hospital, to play Dr. Spivey. Many of the extras were real patients. The cast, Danny DeVito, Christopher Lloyd, Brad Dourif, and others playing the inmates of the ward, spent weeks before shooting just living in the hospital, attending group therapy sessions led by real therapists, learning what institutional life actually felt like. For Jack, the experience was transformative and disturbing. He prepared for roles before, but never anything like this. He watched electroconvulsive therapy being administered, the real thing, not movie magic, and saw the before and after in the patient's eyes. He sat in on group therapy sessions and witnessed grown men struggling to articulate feelings they'd spent lifetimes suppressing. He learned 1,000 small ways that institutions strip people of dignity and agency, how even well-meaning staff could become enforcers of conformity simply by following protocol. The key to the film was the dynamic between McMurphy and Nurse Ratched, played by Louise Fletcher. Ratched had to be something more complex than a simple villain. She had to believe she was helping, had to represent the seductive appeal of safety and order over the dangerous chaos of freedom. Fletcher, an actress who'd been out of the business for years raising her children, brought a chilling calm to the role. She never raised her voice, never lost her composure, and that made her terrifying. Jack and Fletcher barely spoke between takes. It wasn't hostility. It was a choice to maintain the tension between their characters. McMurphy sees Ratched as the enemy of life itself, the enforcer of death and life. Ratched sees McMurphy as a disruptive influence who threatens the fragile equilibrium she's established. Their battle is cosmic, order versus chaos, safety versus freedom, the death drive versus the life force. But it plays out in the mundane details of medication schedules and television privileges. The scene where McMurphy tries to lift the hydrotherapy console, a massive marble fixture that he has no chance of moving, and fails, but declares, "At least I tried, goddammit. At least I tried," became the emotional center of the film. Jack played it with such desperate sincerity that you forget you're watching acting. McMurphy knows he can't win, knows the system will eventually crush him, but his attempt, his refusal to accept defeat without resistance, is what matters. It's what inspires the other patients, particularly the chief, to believe that freedom might be possible. Foreman shot the scene where McMurphy is lobotomized with clinical detachment, making it all the more horrifying. When Chief sees what they've done to his friend, sees that the rebellious spirit has been surgically removed, leaving only a docile vegetable, his decision to smother McMurphy with a pillow becomes an act of mercy and love. Then the Chief lifts the hydrotherapy console that McMurphy couldn't budge, throws it through the window, and escapes into the night. McMurphy's sacrifice wasn't in vain. He woke at least one person fully to life. The film premiered in November 1975, and the reviews were rapturous. Critics recognized that Foreman, Douglas, and the entire cast had created something rare, a film that was simultaneously entertaining and profound, that made serious arguments about freedom and conformity without being preachy, that trusted audiences to think while keeping them engaged. It was exactly the kind of film the new Hollywood was supposed to make, artistically ambitious, socially conscious, emotionally powerful, and commercially viable. One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest became only the second film in history to win all 5 major Academy Awards: Best Picture, Best Director, Best Actor, Best Actress, and Best Screenplay, the first being It Happened One Night in 1934. At the ceremony, Jack gave a characteristically irreverent acceptance speech, thanking his agent for about 10% of this, and generally treating the whole affair with the amused skepticism of someone who'd been on the outside long enough to know the inside was just another performance. But while Jack was reaching the pinnacle of professional success, his personal life was becoming increasingly complicated. He'd divorced Sandra Knight in 1968, after 6 years of marriage. Their daughter Jennifer, born in 1963, spent time between both parents, and Jack tried to be present in her life despite his escalating fame and the chaos that came with it. He'd had a long relationship with Angelica Houston, the daughter of legendary director John Huston, that was passionate and tumultuous. They'd met in 1973, and their relationship would continue, on and off, for nearly 17 years. Jack's house on Mulholland Drive became legendary in Hollywood, a place where the party never really stopped, where actors, directors, musicians, and various hangers-on would gather for marathon sessions of conversation, drugs, and sexual adventure. Warren Beatty lived next door, and the two became inseparable, competing and collaborating in equal measure, chasing women with the same intensity they brought to their work. Marlon Brando, living nearby, would sometimes appear at Jack's gatherings, holding court like a Buddha of method acting while everyone listened in reverence. The drugs were everywhere in 1970s Hollywood, and Jack indulged freely. Cocaine was the drug of choice. It made you feel sharp, made the parties last longer, made the endless conversations seem profound. Jack never pretended to be clean. He was open about his marijuana use, his experimentation with LSD in the 1960s, his appreciation for cocaine's energizing effects. But he also prided himself on being functional, on never letting the drugs interfere with work, on showing up prepared and professional no matter how hard he'd partied the night before. The women were legendary too. Jack had relationships and affairs with some of the most beautiful women in the world, actresses, models, artists. He never married again after Sandra, preferring the freedom of serial monogamy punctuated by periods of enthusiastic promiscuity. He was charming, attentive when he chose to be, and utterly unwilling to be tied down. For many women, the combination of talent, fame, and danger was irresistible, even when they knew the relationship had an expiration date. But beneath all the hedonism, there was work. Always work. Jack was selective about his roles now, turning down far more than he accepted, but when he committed to a project, he gave it everything. In 1976 he made 2 films that couldn't have been more different. The Missouri Breaks, with Marlon Brando, and The Last Tycoon, directed by Elia Kazan from F. Scott Fitzgerald's unfinished novel. The Missouri Breaks was a troubled production. Arthur Penn directed, trying to make a revisionist Western that would say something about America's violent frontier mythology. But Brando, at the height of his eccentric period, decided to play his character, a regulator hired to kill horse thieves, as a series of bizarre improvisations. He showed up in different accents, wore dresses, spoke in Irish brogue, generally made the film impossible to take seriously. Jack, playing the leader of the horse thieves, tried to ground the film in reality, but Brando's antics overwhelmed everything. The film was a critical and commercial failure, but it gave Hollywood one of its great legends, the 2 greatest American actors of their respective generations, completely unable to find a common wavelength. The Last Tycoon was more successful artistically if not commercially. Robert De Niro played Monroe's star, the Irving Thalberg-inspired producer, and Jack took a smaller role as a communist screenwriter. Kazan, who named names during the McCarthy era and lived with that guilt, directed with a somber awareness of Hollywood's capacity for betrayal. The film captured the end of the old studio system with elegance and melancholy, but audiences in 1976, still high on Jaws and anticipating Star Wars, weren't interested in period dramas about Hollywood's past. Then, in 1974, something happened that would shake Jack's understanding of his own identity to its foundation. A researcher for Time magazine, preparing a cover story on Jack following the success of Chinatown, was digging into his family background. The story that Jack had always known, that June was his mother, that Ethel May was his sister, had some inconsistencies. The researcher kept pulling threads, finding discrepancies in dates and documents. Finally, the journalist came to Jack with a question. Did he know that his sister was actually his mother? That June, who he'd called mother his entire life, was actually his grandmother? That the whole architecture of his family identity was a fiction maintained for nearly 40 years. Jack didn't believe it at first. He called family members, demanded explanations, searched for his own documentation. And slowly, terribly, the truth emerged. Ethel May Nicholson, who he'd grown up believing was his older sister, had given birth to him when she was just 17. To avoid the scandal of unwed motherhood in 1937 Depression-era New Jersey, June had decided to raise Jack as her own son. Ethel May had gone along with the plan, becoming his sister, watching her son grow up calling someone else mother. The revelation came too late for Jack to confront the principals. Ethel May had died in 1963, when Jack was 26, still believing she was his sister. June had died in 1970. Taking the secret to her grave. Jack learned the truth about his parentage from a journalist, from public records, from documents that revealed the careful construction of a lie that had shaped his entire existence. His real father, he learned, was Donald Versillo, an Italian-American showman who performed as Don Rose, a song and dance man, a small-time entertainer who'd had an affair with teenage June and then disappeared from the picture. Versillo had other children from his legitimate marriage, which meant Jack had half-siblings he'd never known. The man he'd grown up calling father, John Nicholson, wasn't his biological father at all, just June's husband who'd gone along with the deception. Jack's response to this revelation was characteristic. He didn't grant interviews about it, didn't wallow publicly in the betrayal or confusion. When asked, he'd acknowledge it with a shrug. "I'm Irish. We're used to families with secrets," and change the subject. But privately, friends reported that the discovery was devastating, that it explained things about his life he never quite understood. Why Ethel May had seemed sometimes too interested in his welfare for a sister, why there'd always been a strange tension in the family dynamics, why he'd felt like he never quite fit anywhere. The realization that his entire life had been built on a fundamental lie might have broken someone else. For Jack, an actor who'd spent his career exploring identity and performance, who understood that we all wear masks, who'd made a career out of playing men discovering uncomfortable truths, it was almost too on the nose. His life had turned into one of his movies. But perhaps it also explained his gift. Jack had learned from birth that identity was performance, that the surface story could be completely different from the underlying truth, that people kept secrets that shaped everything while revealing nothing. He'd been method acting his entire life without knowing it, playing the role of June's son while actually being her grandson, living a fiction so complete that he believed it himself. The revelation came just as he was reaching the absolute peak of his fame and power. The Oscar for Cuckoo's Nest meant he could choose any role, command any price, work with any director. But it also came at a moment when his understanding of who he fundamentally was had been shattered. The combination would shape the next phase of his career, leading to some of his most unhinged, dangerous, and fascinating performances. Jack Nicholson had spent the first 37 years of his life not knowing who he really was. Now, with that knowledge, he would spend the next phase showing Hollywood and the world exactly what he could do. Part 4: Madness, Jokers, and the Icon emerges. Stanley Kubrick's phone call came in 1978, and it changed everything. The reclusive director, holed up in his English manner, was adapting Stephen King's novel, The Shining, and wanted Jack for the lead role of Jack Torrance, a recovering alcoholic writer who takes a job as winter caretaker of the isolated Overlook Hotel and descends into murderous madness. Kubrick had watched Jack's work obsessively, particularly his ability to suggest violence beneath charm, rage beneath control. He knew Jack could play a man coming apart. What Jack didn't know when he accepted was that working with Kubrick would be unlike anything he'd experienced. Kubrick was famous, or infamous, for his perfectionism, his endless takes, his psychological manipulation of actors to get the performances he wanted. The production would stretch over a year, with individual scenes requiring 50, 60, even over 100 takes. Kubrick would shoot the same moment from multiple angles, in different ways, keeping his actors perpetually off balance, never quite sure what he was looking for. They shot at Elstree Studios outside London, on sets that recreated the Overlook Hotel with obsessive detail. Kubrick had studied the actual Timberline Lodge in Oregon, then redesigned everything to create impossible architecture. A hotel that couldn't exist in three-dimensional space, with windows where there should be interior walls, rooms that shifted location between scenes. The set itself was a maze, deliberately disorienting, and the cast worked in this labyrinth for months. Jack threw himself into Jack Torrance with unsettling commitment. The character's descent into madness had to feel gradual and inevitable. Not a sudden break but a slow dissolution, a peeling back of civilization to reveal something ancient and cruel underneath. Jack studied the isolation, the alcoholism, the writer's frustration, the masculine rage at inadequacy. He drew on his own demons, his own capacity for anger, the darkness he usually kept controlled. The famous, "Here's Johnny!" scene, where Jack chops through the bathroom door with an axe, sticks his face through the hole, and delivers the line with maniacal glee, wasn't in the script. It was Jack's improvisation, riffing on Ed McMahon's introduction for Johnny Carson on The Tonight Show. Kubrick loved it, kept it in, and created one of cinema's most iconic moments of terror. Jack's face in that moment, the wild eyes, the insane grin, the pure predatory joy, became the definitive image of the film, of madness itself. But the shoot was grueling. Shelley Duvall, playing Jack's terrorized wife Wendy, suffered tremendously under Kubrick's methods. He'd berate her between takes, demand endless repetitions, deliberately create an atmosphere of tension and fear to get authentic terror in her performance. The baseball bat scene on the staircase required 127 takes, leaving Duvall emotionally shattered and physically exhausted. Jack, watching this, understood that Kubrick was using real psychological pressure to generate authentic reactions, that the making of the film was incorporating elements of the horror it was depicting. For Jack, the experience was different. He and Kubrick developed a rapport based on mutual respect and dark humor. They discussed the role endlessly, exploring Jack Torrance's psychology, the nature of the hotel's evil, the question of whether the supernatural elements were real or manifestations of madness. Kubrick never gave definitive answers, preferring ambiguity, knowing that uncertainty was more unsettling than explanation. When The Shining was released in May 1980, the critical response was mixed. Stephen King hated it, feeling Kubrick had removed the heart from his story, turned a tale about family and alcoholism into a cold technical exercise. Some critics agreed, finding the film visually stunning but emotionally distant. Others recognized they were watching a masterpiece, a film that would grow in stature and influence, that would redefine horror cinema. Jack's performance divided opinion too. Some found it too big, too theatrical, lacking the psychological realism he'd brought to earlier roles. Others understood that this was precisely the point. Jack Torrance had to be theatrical, had to be performing his own dissolution, because that's what madness often is, a grotesque parody of sanity, trying too hard to appear normal until it explodes into chaos. Over time, The Shining became recognized as one of the greatest horror films ever made, and Jack's work in it as one of his most iconic performances. The image of him breaking through the door, the typewriter pages revealing, "All work and no play makes Jack a dull boy," typed thousands of times, the frozen Jack at the end. These moments entered the cultural bloodstream, referenced and parodied endlessly. But while The Shining was finding its audience through the 1980s, Jack was navigating a changing Hollywood landscape. The new Hollywood was dying, killed by the very success it had generated. Jaws and Star Wars had shown studios that blockbusters could make more money than anyone had imagined, and the industry was shifting away from character-driven adult dramas towards spectacle and franchises. Directors who'd been given creative freedom in the 1970s now found themselves working within studio constraints again. Jack adapted by being selective and maintaining his power through sheer star presence. He made The Postman Always Rings Twice in 1981 with Bob Rafelson, reuniting with the director of 5 Easy Pieces, for a steaming war that gave Jack and Jessica Lange some of the most sexually explicit scenes mainstream American cinema had yet seen. He played Eugene O'Neill in Reds for Warren Beatty, a small but memorable role in Beatty's epic about American journalist John Reed and the Russian Revolution. Then came Terms of Endearment in 1983, and Jack surprised everyone by playing Garrett Breedlove, a washed-up astronaut and unrepentant womanizer who becomes romantically involved with his uptight neighbor. The role was supporting, almost a cameo, but Jack made it unforgettable. Garrett was all the things Jack had been accused of being in real life: vain, selfish, hedonistic, but played with such charm and ultimate decency that you couldn't help loving him. Director James L. Brooks let Jack improvise extensively, and the result was a performance of such natural ease that it barely seemed like acting. The scene where Garrett drives his Corvette down the beach, yelling, "Give me a call! I like you!" to Aurora, Shirley MacLaine, was pure Jack, mixing absurdity with genuine feeling. The Academy gave him his second Oscar, this time for Best Supporting Actor, making him one of the few performers to win in both lead and supporting categories. By the mid-1980s, Jack was in his late 40s, an age when many leading men started fading or transitioning to character roles. But Jack, paradoxically, was becoming more essential. His very presence brought credibility and edge to projects. When he signed on to something, it meant the film would be taken seriously, that there would be at least one performance worth watching, that some element of danger or unpredictability would be present. He made Prizzy's Honor in 1985 with John Huston, reuniting with Angelica Houston, John's daughter and Jack's on-again, off-again partner, for a dark comedy about hitmen in love. Jack played Charlie Partana, a mob enforcer who's dangerously stupid about everything except killing, falling for a woman who's even more ruthless than he is. The performance required Jack to play against his intelligence, to make stupidity charming, and he pulled it off brilliantly, earning another Oscar nomination. But it was Batman, in 1989, that showed how completely Jack understood his own iconography and how to leverage it for maximum impact. Director Tim Burton was making a dark, gothic version of the comic book hero, and he needed a Joker who could match the film's operatic tone. Jack negotiated one of the shrewdest deals in Hollywood history, a percentage of the film's gross, including merchandising, that would eventually earn him over $60 million, making him one of the highest-paid actors ever for a single role. His performance as the Joker was Jack Nicholson unleashed. Every mannerism and tic he'd ever deployed turned up to 11. The grin that had been wolfish in Chinatown became a rictus of permanent insanity. The unpredictability that had made George Hanson charming became homicidal chaos. The intelligence that had made his characters dangerous became pure malevolent creativity. Jack understood that the Joker was all the darkness in his previous roles stripped of any redemptive qualities, evil as performance art. The scene where the Joker defaces paintings in the Gotham Museum while dancing to Prince's music, sparing only one work, Francis Bacon screaming Pope, because I kinda like this one, was Jack at his most anarchically joyful. He was playing a character who found murder and mayhem genuinely funny, who existed to create chaos for its own sake, and he was clearly having the time of his life doing it. Burton gave Jack freedom to improvise, and the result was endlessly quotable. "Wait till they get a load of me. Have you ever danced with the devil in the pale moonlight? This town needs an enema." Every line was delivered with a showman's timing, a comedian's precision, and a psychopath's sincerity. Jack made the Joker both terrifying and magnetic, impossible to look away from even when he was doing horrible things. Batman became a cultural phenomenon, grossing over $400 million worldwide and proving that superhero films could be dark, adult, and artistically ambitious. Jack's Joker became the template against which all future interpretations would be measured, until Heath Ledger's posthumous Oscar-winning performance in The Dark Knight offered a radically different approach nearly 20 years later. Throughout the 1980s, Jack's personal life continued to be a tabloid fascination. His relationship with Angelica Houston finally ended in the late 1980s when she discovered he'd fathered a child with actress Rebecca Broussard. The breakup was messy and painful, played out in gossip columns and celebrity magazines. Angelica, who'd won her own Oscar for Prizzy's Honor, moved on to a successful career and eventually married sculptor Robert Graham. Jack remained with Broussard for several years, having another child with her, but never married. He was spotted courtside at Lakers games, sitting in his regular seats, becoming as much a part of the Los Angeles basketball scene as any player. His friendships with other celebrities, Warren Beatty, Marlon Brando, Dennis Hopper, Harry Dean Stanton, were legendary, and his Mulholland Drive house remained a gathering place for Hollywood's most interesting and excessive personalities. But Jack also maintained friendships outside the industry, writers, artists, regular people he'd known since his struggling days, and he was famous among those who knew him for his generosity, his willingness to help friends in trouble, his loyalty to people who'd been there before the fame. The public Jack, the leering, sunglasses-wearing, Lakers-attending icon, was real, but it wasn't the whole story. By 1990, Jack Nicholson had been a star for over 20 years, had survived the transition from new Hollywood rebel to mainstream icon, had won 2 Oscars and been nominated 7 times, and had given performances in films ranging from biker movies to horror to comic book blockbusters. He'd learned his true parentage and integrated that knowledge without letting it destroy him. He'd indulged in every excess Hollywood could offer and remained functional and professional. He was 53 years old, an age when most actors start planning their retirement or accepting grandfather roles. But Jack had something else in mind. The 1990s would bring some of his most powerful work, his most interesting choices, and his final evolution from actor to institution. The legend was only getting bigger, and Jack Nicholson was just getting started on the last act. Part 5: The Final Act and the Legend's Rest. The 1990s opened with Jack Nicholson standing at a curious crossroads. He was wealthy beyond measure. The Batman deal alone had made him financially independent for life. He was respected universally, his talent undisputed even by critics who sometimes questioned his choices. He could do anything, work with anyone, or retire completely and spend his days courtside at Lakers games. Instead, he chose to keep working, but with an increasingly discerning eye, taking roles that interested him rather than roles that would maintain his stardom. In 1992, he reunited with director Rob Reiner for A Few Good Men, playing Colonel Nathan Jessup, a Marine officer whose adherence to military code conceals a darker truth. The role was supporting. The film belonged to Tom Cruise as the young Navy lawyer prosecuting a murder case, but Jack made it the film's centerpiece. Jessup appeared in only a few scenes, but Jack's presence dominated everything, the character's certainty and pride radiating menace. The climactic courtroom confrontation gave Jack one of cinema's most quoted speeches. When Cruise's character demands the truth, Jack's Jessup explodes with righteous fury, defending the hard men who stand on walls, who do terrible things so others can sleep safely. The speech, about honor, duty, and the moral compromises required to maintain civilization, was delivered with such conviction that it became instantly iconic, turned into memes and parodies, quoted by everyone from politicians to comedians. What made the performance remarkable was that Jack made you understand Jessup's perspective even while condemning his actions. This was a man who genuinely believed in the code he lived by, who saw himself as protecting something essential, who couldn't understand how his duty could be questioned. Jack played him without irony or distance, giving full weight to the character's worldview before revealing its corruption. He received his 10th Oscar nomination for the role. Then came Hoffa, later that year, directed by Danny DeVito, Jack's old friend from Cuckoo's Nest. Playing Jimmy Hoffa, the legendary and eventually disappeared Teamsters leader, Jack disappeared into the role completely. He studied Hoffa obsessively, the voice, the gestures, the combative energy, and emerged with a performance that felt like possession. This wasn't Jack Nicholson playing Jimmy Hoffa. This was Jimmy Hoffa somehow channeled through Jack's instrument. The film traced Hoffa's rise from truck driver to union president to target of Robert Kennedy's Justice Department, showing both his genuine advocacy for workers and his connections to organized crime. Jack played Hoffa as a true believer corrupted by power, a man who started fighting for the little guy and ended up becoming the thing he'd fought against. The performance was muscular and tragic, showing a life that spiraled from idealism to paranoia to violent end. But despite strong reviews for Jack's work, Hoffa underperformed commercially. Audiences in 1992 weren't interested in stories about labor unions and political corruption, not when they could see dinosaurs in Jurassic Park or explosions in countless action films. Jack didn't seem to care. He made the film he wanted to make, given the performance he wanted to give, and box office was someone else's problem. In 1997, at age 60, Jack took on a role that would earn him his third Oscar and cement his status as one of the greatest actors in cinema history. As Good as It Gets, directed by James L. Brooks, cast him as Melvin Udall, a misanthropic romance novelist suffering from severe obsessive-compulsive disorder who forms unlikely connections with a waitress and his gay neighbor. Melvin was Jack's most complex creation, simultaneously repulsive and sympathetic, cruel and vulnerable, locked in patterns of behavior he couldn't control even as he desperately wanted connection. Jack played the OCD with clinical precision, the rituals and compulsions completely believable, but never let it become the whole character. Beneath the disorder was a lonely man terrified of intimacy, using his condition and his nastiness as armor against a world he couldn't navigate. The role required Jack to be genuinely horrible. Melvin's homophobic and racist remarks weren't played for easy laughs but shown as genuine toxicity, while remaining someone the audience would root for. It was a tightrope walk, and Jack navigated it perfectly. His chemistry with Helen Hunt, playing the waitress Carol, was magical, their scenes together crackling with genuine feeling beneath the verbal sparring. The famous line, when Carol asks Melvin to give her a compliment, and he tells her, "You make me want to be a better man," could have been mawkish in another actor's hands. Jack delivered it with such raw honesty, such evident surprise at his own sincerity, that it became one of cinema's great romantic moments. Here was a man who'd built walls his entire life suddenly glimpsing the possibility of something more. At the 1998 Academy Awards, Jack won his third Oscar, becoming one of only 3 male actors to achieve that feat, along with Walter Brennan and Daniel Day-Lewis. At 61, accepting the statuette, he was gracious and charming, thanking Hunt and Brooks, acknowledging the cast and crew. But there was also a sense that he knew this might be his last major triumph, that the Hollywood he'd helped create was changing again, becoming something he didn't entirely recognize. The late 1990s and early 2000s saw Jack working steadily but with mixed results. He made The Pledge, with Sean Penn, a dark thriller about an obsessed detective that was too bleak for audiences. He appeared in About Schmidt in 2002, playing a recently retired insurance actuary facing mortality and meaninglessness, delivering a performance of quiet devastation that earned another Oscar nomination. The film's final shot, Schmidt weeping while reading a letter from a Tanzanian boy he'd been sponsoring, was Jack at his most vulnerable, all the bravado stripped away. He worked with Martin Scorsese on The Departed in 2006, playing Frank Costello, a Boston mob boss based loosely on Whitey Bulger. At 69, Jack was no longer playing leading men but character roles, and he attacked Costello with relish. The performance was pure menace. Costello was violence personified, utterly without redemption, a shark that had to keep moving and killing or die. Scorsese let Jack improvise extensively, and the result was unpredictable and terrifying, a reminder of the danger Jack could still project. The Departed won Best Picture, Scorsese's first Oscar after multiple nominations, and Jack received another supporting actor nomination. The film's success demonstrated that Jack could still open movies, still draw audiences, still deliver performances that justified his legendary status. But it also felt like a capstone, a final demonstration of powers everyone already knew he possessed. After The Departed, Jack's output slowed dramatically. He made The Bucket List with Morgan Freeman, a sentimental comedy drama about terminally ill men completing their life goals. He appeared in How Do You Know? With Reese Witherspoon, a romantic comedy that barely registered. And then, after 2010, he essentially stopped acting altogether. The reasons for Jack's retirement, never officially announced but evident in his absence, were speculated about endlessly. Some said he'd lost his memory, that he couldn't remember lines anymore. Others suggested he simply didn't need to work, didn't want to work, had done everything he wanted to do. Friends said he was content watching Lakers games, spending time with his children and grandchildren, living quietly in Los Angeles rather than performing for the world. What was undeniable was that Jack Nicholson had earned his rest. Over a career spanning more than 50 years, he'd appeared in over 60 films, received 12 Academy Award nominations, won 3 Oscars, and created some of cinema's most indelible characters. He'd been there at the birth of New Hollywood, survived its death, and remained relevant through multiple generations of filmmaking. His influence was everywhere in actors who came after him. The willingness to be unlikable, the intelligence in performance, the unpredictability, the ability to be both threatening and charming in the same moment. You could see traces of Jack in everyone from Sean Penn to Christian Bale to Joaquin Phoenix. He'd shown that leading men didn't have to be conventionally handsome, that intelligence and danger could be more compelling than physical perfection. By 2025, Jack was approaching 90 years old, spotted occasionally at Lakers games or around Los Angeles. A living legend who had chosen privacy over continued performance. His films were studied in film schools, analyzed by critics, watched and rewatched by audiences who discovered them across generations. Chinatown, One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, The Shining, Batman, A Few Good Men, As Good as It Gets. These weren't just movies. They were cultural touchstones, defining works of American cinema. The boy born in Neptune City, New Jersey, in 1937, raised on a lie, who'd struggled for decades before finding success, who'd indulged every excess Hollywood offered while remaining fundamentally professional and committed to craft, who'd played heroes and villains and everything in between. That boy had become the star of his century. Jack Nicholson's story was essentially American, the self-made man, the rebel who became an institution, the outsider who conquered the establishment on his own terms. He'd lived multiple lives, the struggling actor, the new Hollywood rebel, the superstar, the icon, the legend. Through all of it, he'd maintained something authentic, something wild, something that refused to be completely tamed by success or age or the demands of respectability. In the end, what Jack Nicholson proved was that you could be successful without compromising, famous without losing yourself, legendary without becoming a monument. He'd shown that the grin could be wolfish and genuine simultaneously, that danger and decency could coexist, that you could acknowledge the darkness in yourself and still choose to be, as Melvin Udall put it, a better man. The camera loved him, audiences loved him, and he loved the work, even when he pretended not to care, even when he acted like it was all just a game. And maybe that's the final truth about Jack Nicholson. He understood that it was all performance, that identity itself was something we construct and reconstruct constantly, that the mask and the face beneath it were both real and both artifice. He'd been playing roles his entire life, starting before he even knew it, in a family drama scripted by others. And he'd turned that foundational fiction into art, into a career, into a legacy that would outlast everyone who'd tried to define or contain him. The star of the century had earned his rest, but the work remained, flickering on screens, living in cultural memory, inspiring new generations to take risks, to be fearless, to grin into the darkness and see what grins back.